QSO Today, episode 235, Dan Gravereaux N1ZZ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, announcing the new IC9700 all-mode transceiver for the world above 144 MHz, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver and parts and modules for the ham radio builder. Links to both ICOM America and QRP Labs are in this episode's show notes pages. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric N1ZZ, your host. My guest this week is Dan Gravereaux N1ZZ, whose passion for electronics and amateur radio, beginning as a kid, led to a career at CBS Labs in the days of quadraphonic sound, to the founding of West Mountain Radio, whose Rigblaster product got many ham radio operators into the digital modes like PSK31. It was West Mountain Radio that popularized the Anderson power pole connectors that are now a common staple of ham radio installations. Now in retirement, N1ZZ is still creating products for amateur radio operators, operating contests from the Caribbean, and chasing DX. N1ZZ, this is Eric N1ZZ. Are you there, Dan?
Yes, I am, Eric.
Dan, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, very interesting. It started when I was about 16 years old, and I received a Boy Scout one-tube radio. And I built it, and I didn't wind the coils correctly, and I heard hams. I think they were on the 160-meter band, and I heard someone give his name. So I called the person up and talked to him, and he was a high school senior. And I went to his radio station. He was a general, and I heard him have a QSO with someone, I think, in California. And I was so excited that he told me to buy a QST magazine that said how to become a ham radio operator. And I did that. And within 3 months, I went down to take my novice license in New York City.
I see. And what was the hometown?
The hometown was New Canaan, Connecticut, not too far from New York City, about 50 miles away.
Did you have any mentors or Elmers when you started in ham radio?
Not really. I went to his house a few times, and he helped me a little bit with CW, but basically I just stayed at home practicing CW, and then I bought a Heathkit radio, an AR2 I think it was, and I listened to CW and listened to W1AW to practice my CW.
Okay, so what year were you first licensed?
1958, around November, I think.
And that was a novice license. And do you remember your first call sign?
Yes, it was KN1DMG, Kilo November 1 Delta Mike Golf.
And how long did you have that call sign before you upgraded?
Probably until about February, I think. So I had it about 4 months, and then I went down and took the general class license, and then about 6 weeks later, had to wait that long to receive the FCC indication that I had become a general, and I became K1DMG. They dropped the N off my call.
The call sign that you have now is a vanity call sign.
Well, not exactly. They didn't have the vanity call signs when they did that, and about 5 or 6 years, no, maybe 10 years later, I was working as an engineer, and suddenly the ARRL decided to invent licensing that had more than just general class license, and they started with the extra and the advanced and extra, and they were taking away my privileges. So at that time, I went right down and took my extra and my advanced and extra license, and they said that you could choose 4 call signs and send it in, and maybe you'd get one of them. And I got N1ZZ. I
see. To define at that time that the N defined that you were an extra class, and plus it was what they call this a 1+2?
Yes, but the N was just a brand new ham prefix. They had just started it, and I tried to get my initials in K and W and N. I didn't get them, but I got the ZZ. And what was interesting, just a interesting story. When I went on the air first with the N1ZZ, people kept asking me what country was I from, and I said from the USA, and they didn't believe it because N had never been used until that month.
I think I remember those. That was like in the early 80s, I think?
Probably in the 80s or maybe the late 70s. I've actually forgotten the date that I did that.
They also brought out the A prefix as well, I think at the same time, A and N, in addition to the K and W. What was your first rig?
Oh, it was my actual transmitter was an Heathkit AT1, a 6L6 oscillator amplifier, and the receiver was an ARC-5 for 3.5 megahertz.
So you were an 80-meter operator in the ham band.
Correct.
And how was that for you?
Well, I loved it, but it was absolutely amazing. I got on there, and my first QSO was with a ham in Dobbs Ferry in New York, and I was so excited I couldn't believe it. And 4 days later, I got a QSL card from him, and that just made my day. And I went on 80 meters a lot. Of course, the ARC-5 bandwidth was so wide, you could hear the entire band. You had to listen to the tone of the CW to pick out the station you needed or you wanted to work.
How did you upgrade your rig after that when you went and got the general class?
I upgraded to a DX40, which was a Heathkit with some screen grid modulation. And my receiver, I went down and I bought a Hammerland HQ100 in New York City.
And do you remember the place you bought it? As I remember, there was a Radio Row in New York City then, right?
Well, I didn't buy it at Radio. Oh, maybe I did, but it was Harrison Radio. The big store in New York City was Harrison Radio, and I bought the receiver there. And of course, I bought the Heathkit I ordered it online. I don't mean online, via mail at that time.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, yeah. It sure did. First of all, I was very, very involved with ham radio as a high schooler, and when I decided to go to college, I went to the University of Connecticut, and I majored in electrical engineering there. So that's what I wanted to do, and I dived right into it.
And did you take an advanced degree as well?
No. I graduated with a BSEE. I did go and I took many courses as a graduate engineer, but I never completed the amount of courses required to get another degree. At that time, in the university, we had a war going on in Vietnam, and people were being drafted. So I spent I did not want to graduate and get drafted, so I joined the Army Reserve, which prevented me from being drafted in a bad situation. So.
Yeah, I remember those years. How did your career proceed from there? Out of college.
Okay, what happened was I went to the University of Connecticut, and it was a tough time for me there. I didn't do very well in the beginning, but by my senior year, all of my ham radio experience in electronics worked for me in the laboratory section of my education. And I, at that time, the transistor was just becoming popular. And my senior project was I made an amplifier with a gain of 10. It didn't matter which transistor you used. It always came out with a gain of 10. My professor thought I should have paid more attention to the transistor and make it have more gain. But when I left and I had done my Army stint, I went to CBS Laboratories, and I had an interview there. They asked me, was I good at transistor amplifiers? Did I know anything about them? At that time, people were just transitioning from tubes. And I said I did. And they put me on the Gemini spacecraft tape recorder project. And I was the engineer for the record and playback amplifiers using transistors. And that's why I got my job there, both by being a ham radio operator and knowing electronics, and secondly, having made my senior activity in transistor amplifiers.
Well, it seemed that you must have stayed in the audio business, because I found an article that you co-wrote in 1973 with Benjamin Bauer and Gerald Budelman called Recording Techniques for SQ Matrix Quadraphonic Discs. What was your involvement in the recording and audio industry?
Oh, well, I stayed at CBS Laboratories for a while, and we got out of the working for the government agencies, and I was put in charge of the Columbia Records engineering and research department. I was eventually in charge of it. I started, of course, as a project engineer, and one of our projects there was to develop quadraphonic sound, and I was the lead investigator on that, and we developed many different quadraphonic systems, and one of them was the SQ matrix system that was chosen to be used there. And I have quite a few patents in that area on quadraphonic sound. As a matter of fact, that project lasted quite a while. It was very popular for a while, of course, until digital came along that had the ability to have many, many tracks. But at that time, trying to get four channels of audio off a record was a trick. And we used that matrix system. And I stayed with that for a long time while I was at CBS Laboratories.
Well, I think our listeners are old enough to remember vinyl records, and I guess vinyl records are actually coming back into the marketplace. What's interesting to me, or what I think I seem to remember, is that quadraphonic systems were being sold, and that was 4 speakers, right? It was before surround sound. It was just a way to kind of make the concert hall experience even more realistic.
Yes, it was used. Well, that was the original intent, but it became more and more to be 4 distinct sounds coming from around you. In other words, there were people like Enoch White that would put each major instrument group in the 4 corners, and so you would be sitting in the middle of a recording. A playback session. So it was used artistically in many, many, many ways. The most exciting ways really was to try to capture the sound of a concert hall and have the sound around you. But the young folks like to have music in the round.
I seem to remember it, but I don't remember that it lasted very long. I even remember that there were quadraphonic headphones with 2 speakers front and back in the headphones themselves. It was a great idea.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, people took advantage of stuff in a positive way. They even manufactured quadraphonic microphones that had 4 cardioid elements in them, so that they would put that in the middle of an orchestra and record an orchestra in the round. It didn't really catch on, but all these things were going on. And then, of course, as all of this progressed, there were many different systems. There was a Sansui system, there was a BMX system, there was an RCA system that actually recorded a carrier on the phonograph record, and the carrier was then used to carry the audio for the 2 back channels, whereas the 2 front channels were carried by the groove itself. So there were a lot of competing systems.
Did quadraphonic ultimately find its way into music CDs?
Well, it's done both. It did make it into CDs, and you could buy them at that time. But what was interesting was that it sort of disappeared. Instead, surround sound became popular, and all of the CBS patents, and my name was on about 6 of them, they all ended up in Dolby's hands. He purchased them and developed surround sound and all of the other things about it. In other words, there was surround sound, and then the equipment manufacturers started making playback equipment with 5 speakers. And you could buy it, and so you'd have a center front, and then the left and the right, and the back, and there were even people that made them with 6 speakers to have a center back sound, which really doesn't work too well, but people did it.
I see that online that you're a DXer. Are you also a contester?
Yes, sure am. I love DX. It started with my first DX QSO. I couldn't believe it. Okay, my first DX that really got to me really wasn't DX, but I was on 80 meters running my 20 watts and my dipole, and I talked to someone in Miami, Florida, and I couldn't believe it. I said, "This is unbelievable." And then we learned that we could take my Heathkit AT1 and put a 7 megahertz crystal in it and tune the oscillator to the third harmonic and get 21 megahertz, and 15-meter band had just opened up. And I called a CQ down there, never having operated in the band, and a station came back from Germany. And it took me a long time to get his call because I'd never heard a DJ before. And I finally understood his call, and then he said his name was Horst. And then he said he lived in Stuttgart. And I say, what is this? And that's when the DX bug bit, and I just started chasing DX from then on.
You're also a contester, is that right?
Oh, yeah. Well, first let me explain. I've talked to 368 countries. That's much more, and a bunch of those are now deleted. The only country I haven't talked to on the current list is North Korea. Even though there have been hams there, that's the only country I'm lacking. And when you get into a contest, especially the CQ Worldwide contest, it's typically you will work 140 countries in that contest if you get into it and you have a big station. So you can work that, and it's not hard to do it because the bands change night and day, and during the day, the propagation just leads you to other places all the time.
Now, you're now retired, or I shouldn't say retired. You're semi-retired, right, and living in Florida? That's
correct.
Okay. What's the current rig down there?
Oh, I've got a 756 Pro, and I've got a Ten-Tech Titan.
So that's an ICOM IC756 Pro.
Yes, it is. And I've had it for a while.
And do you operate an amplifier or anything like that?
Well, I have it here, but I haven't hooked it up because I only moved here a couple of years ago, and I don't have 220 in my ham shack. So it's not run here. And I run over to the club station, the P-Cars club station, and use their rig for chasing DX when I need to, or when I have fun. I'll explain more about that in a little while if you'd like.
Sure. What kind of antenna do you have on your QTH there?
Oh, I've got an R6A, I think it is. It's I'm in an area where I don't want to really put up a big antenna. So it's a vertical antenna. I have 2 antennas, but the vertical is 20 through 6 meters, and it's a vertical dipole, so it's not a quarter wave. It's a dipole, and I have it about 20 feet above the roof, so it sticks up about 65 feet above. It's an interesting antenna. It works pretty well here.
And you use it for transmitting and receiving? You said you had 2 antennas.
Oh, yes, I do. Well, I have a 40-meter dipole strung between the palm trees, but that's only up about 35 feet, so it's not... I can work everything I can hear, but it doesn't have any gain in any direction.
And now this message from ICOM America. I'm so excited to be able to tell you about the new ICOM IC9700 SDR transceiver. ICOM had in mind the weak signal operator when it applied its DSP and direct sampling technology to the IC9700's receiver design, allowing the operator to dig out the faintest signals from moon bounce and meteor scatter contacts. The ICOM IC9700 is a tri-band VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz transceiver. Operating modes include AM single sideband, FM, CW, RTTY, and all of the digital modes. You can even use the IC9700 to talk on the local D-Star repeater, making it an ideal rig for exploring the amateur bands 2 meters and above. For the satellite operator, the IC9700 has dual independent receivers that allow full duplex crossband operation with normal and reverse tracking, and 99 memory slots for your favorite satellites. The IC9700 is beautifully appointed with an almost identical footprint to the IC7300. It will make a beautiful sidekick to your current HF rig in your shack. With its 4.3-inch color touchscreen, you can easily control the rig and find the band activity using the waterfall display. To learn more about the IC9700 or any of the other fine ICOM products, go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur or click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit your local ICOM dealer to purchase your IC9700, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Palm trees tend to sway. Do you have pulleys holding your antennas, and so with some weights to kind of let the palm trees move around?
No, I don't. It's a little bit silly, but I let it sag in the middle. So when it sways, it might pull tight. It hasn't pulled tight enough to snap the wire off the insulators yet, but I let it sag in the middle. It's about 30 feet in the middle and 42 to 45 feet on both ends.
What's your favorite operating mode?
CW.
Now, I'm asking this because you're the founder of West Mountain Radio, and many of us know West Mountain Radio because West Mountain Radio were the creators of the Rigblaster, and I think the Rigblaster was like the device at the time that got many hams on the digital modes. So it's interesting that you're a CW operator. That's your favorite, but you also created this amazing device at the time that allowed people to operate the digital modes. How did that business start, and where did it take you?
Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, my company was a commercial company. I had left CBS Laboratories and done some stuff, and I had a commercial company, and I was making amplifiers for the railroads, for the New York City subways, audio amplifiers for them. And the contract didn't end, but it was stopped because New York City was lean on money, and they pulled the contract on us. So I didn't know what to do for a while, and we had just had a ham club meeting at which one of the gentlemen was describing PSK31. So we had just all gone home, and a couple of us had made an interface. And we thought this was absolutely amazing what you could do on PSK31. So we decided to make it into a product and sell it at the next Dayton Hamfest. And we did. We made it, and it was a honey of a project. We made it to operate with all computers and with all radios by using jumpers on the mic connections. And we sold about $35,000 of a $100 product in one booth in Dayton that year. I think it was the year 2000, around that time.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I think in those days, if we think back almost 20 years, you were using the serial port on your computer, right, in order to make that digital coming out?
No, not exactly. The serial port was used just for the push-to-talk command. The audio came from the sound card, both the mic input and the audio output. They served as getting into the radio through the radio's mic connector that was plugged into the Rigblaster. So we had two wires: a wire going to the audio in and the audio out on the computer, the sound card, and then one wire going to the for the PTT on the on the RS-232 port, and that's what did it. It was a very simple product. The problem was that we wanted to isolate the radio from the computer because we didn't want to have all the grounds giving us ground loops through all this hookup stuff. So we used a transformer to do that.
Well, I actually have one of those original Rigblasters sitting on my desk here, and I've had it just recently connected to my K2 to listen to FT8. So those things, if you find them now in the used market, they still work great.
And they sure do.
How did the West Mountain Radio then evolve in terms of its ham radio product line?
Well, what happened was we did so very well with this that we got all excited. We said, what are we going to do next? And some of my ham radio operators, they were flying electric model airplanes, model airplanes with electric engines. And those folks had started to use power pole connectors because the motors take sometimes 20 amps to run these electric motors for these big model airplanes. And we looked at these connectors and we said, my gosh, wouldn't they be fabulous for DC to connect your DC around your ham station? So we came out with a thing called a rig runner, and we put 10 pairs of these on a PC board and, of course, in a metal box, and sold it as a DC power strip. And that just took off like hotcakes, okay? Because everybody was trying to work with Molex connectors and, five-way binding posts and barrier strips and everything else. And suddenly this became the way to clean up the wiring around your ham station. And boy, did that take off.
Well, I think that you've changed the whole paradigm for the way that we connect our equipment now. I buy the power poles by the pound. And everything, if it's 12 volts, it has a power pole connector on it.
I know, and it's amazing. And just a little interesting story about the, I think I told you I go down to PJ2T, and I brought down about 6 of these power strips down there to the station, and they have 4 complete kilowatt stations there. And they were so thrilled to be able to neaten up all the wiring in the DC with the power strips that they just, we spent all day long laughing about how we neatened our ham station.
As I recall that the West Mountain Radio catalog actually has gotten quite large. One of the things I've kind of felt that was always needed, at least for me anyway, is that if you've been in ham radio for 40, 50 years, you have a lot of stuff. You have a lot of rigs that you haven't gotten rid of. And wouldn't it be nice to have like one box that says, if I select this rig on the box, all the audio, all of the push-to-talk controls, all of the everything goes to my headset, speakers, and microphone and key.
Yes.
I think is that a product, or that was a product I think that you guys came up with, right?
It was a product. We called that the Rigblaster Duo. It was called the Rigblaster Duo, and it didn't do very well. We didn't sell many of them. And one of the funny things about that is that the people that have reviewed it didn't look at it in terms of the fact that it switched everything nicely for you. They talked about how it was used for PSK31 and things like that. And it didn't take off. And that was our first product, by the way, that we had done as surface mount. And when I sold West Mountain Radio, they did not continue that product, which sort of surprised all of us.
I'd be happy to have a Rigblaster quartet just to be able to hook the radios together.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Since, as you know, I've been developing products. That's on my list right now for something that I'd like to come out with my new little small ventures that I'm doing here. But it sounds like fun. I'd love to work on that and develop it. Thank you.
That leads me to my next question, and that is that as I'm researching you, I found that you actually have a new company called Paradan Radio.
That's right, Paradan.
It's kind of hard to keep an entrepreneur in the garage, right?
You're right, and it's curious about that, because what happened was, since I got rid of everything and sold the company, sold West Mountain Radio, all my friends kept calling me and saying, Dan, why don't you continue to make stuff? And of course, I had to wait because I had a non-disclosure. I had an agreement that I couldn't start something for a while. Okay, so as soon as that agreement date had passed, I started making things for my friends, and they weren't selling too many of them, so I decided to put my name on them as well and market them, and that's why Paradigm Radio exists. And I've had some new products since then, and it's fun. It gives me the chance to attend hamventions and sell product and feel as though I'm part of the manufacturing, selling, and having fun team of ham radio.
Hey, this is Eric with this quick break. I'm a big podcast listener with over 20 podcasts loaded automatically into my smartphone every week. My favorite ham radio podcast is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George KJ6VU and Jeremy KF7IJZ. Every other week, George and Jeremy take a deep dive into their Workbench projects that become boards and plans on their website. If you're a ham radio builder or want to be a home brewer, then be sure to click on the link to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast in this week's show notes page. What are you focusing? What kind of products are you focusing on there at Paradigm Radio?
Okay. Well, basically, I've done some of the older products and just re-upped them. But my newest products, the ones that I'm really focusing on and that are doing very well, I have the best-selling product that I have is called the antenna disconnect, or the antenna disconnect actuator. And it's a product, since I'm down here in Florida, where we have lightning strikes and lightning surges continuously all during the summer. It's a product that disconnects your antenna from your radio when you're not at your radio running your station. It's a very simple product. It uses commercial relays inside of it, 15-amp contact relays, and the device works as follows. First, I'll describe where you put it. You put it at the output of your station. So if your station is a radio, this goes between the antenna output of your radio and your antenna. Okay. If your station has an amplifier, you'll put this between your amplifier and your antenna. And if your station has a tuner as the last element of the station, you put it at the output of the tuner into the antenna. Okay. And how it works is simple. When your radio is not turned on, the relays in here have taken the antenna side and shorted it to ground and lifted it completely from your radio. So the center of your coax and the shield of your coax has been pulled off your radio and shorted to ground. So your radio is now floating.
So you want this device maybe outside or on the kind of the quote-unquote bulkhead of the house?
Yes.
So you've got a good ground. You want a nice water pipe ground or ground rod ground.
Exactly. And if you put it right outside the window of your ham shack, as an example, on the bulkhead, you run that ground right to ground, and you do not run the ground on the disconnector over to your radio, because then that puts a higher voltage when you have a lightning surge on your radio. So you have to run it to earth directly.
How do you power that? Do you have a control line, or are you actually running power down the coax?
No, we're not running it down the coax, because if you recall, the coax is totally lifted. So there's nothing in the device that would connect to the coax. So
on the radio side of the switch.
That's right. But you power it. We have a red and black little wire coming out, and you run that to the back of a modern radio that has a 12-volt auxiliary output, or you run that to your power supply. So when you sit down at your radio station, you turn on your power supply or your radio, and then the relays in the antenna disconnect now connect you up properly to connect your antenna properly to your radio. So when you turn your power off on your radio or the power off on your power supply, then you're in the protect mode and the antenna side is shorted to ground.
Well, I think this kind of product seems to go with talks that you used to give, or maybe you still give, to ham radio clubs on how to wire your station correctly. How do hams often wire their stations incorrectly?
The biggest incorrectness is that they don't understand, and I don't want to put anyone down here, okay, because we often forget and don't, think well now. But the biggest problem of wiring it incorrectly is they use wire that's much too small in AWG, or the gauge of the wire is too small. They forget that you have to run a lot of current into your devices, okay? So you'll find that someone will wire a station with number 16 wire over to your power supply, and you'll have a voltage drop, and then your radio will not put out sufficient power. So that's the first error that people make. And the second error people make is they don't use power poles, or they don't use good connectors, because there are many connectors out there, and I don't want to put anyone down really, but there are connectors that have round pins on them. And the plug has a round pin, and the socket has two flat pins that touch the round pin. Well, you don't get a good connection there, and these connections corrode, and they spark and corrode. And I found so many stations that just have voltage drops in their transmitter that you can't believe. And so when I talk about wiring, I say keep the wires as short as possible, use the heaviest gauge that makes sense, and always check your wiring with a voltmeter to make sure that you're getting proper voltage, because we have voltage drops all over the place. One person that I know had about 5 rig runners in series. Well, you end up by getting 10 power poles in series, and each one of them has a drop too, and you'll lose almost a volt sometimes.
You seem to have changed the hobby with the Anderson power poles.
Well, I'll tell you another funny story about power poles. It's silly, but of course, power poles, our company was in business to make money. And I'll never forget, when we were doing things with power poles, I bought them by the tens of thousands, okay? And I didn't have very good cash flow, so I couldn't pay the bill on time. So Anderson called me up and says, we're cutting you out of buying directly from us because you haven't paid the bill, and it's been 35 or 40 days, and unless you pay us right away, we can't ship the next one. And I said, but I've changed the world for power poles. Everyone's using them. And they said, well, it doesn't matter what you've done unless you pay the bill. So their chief engineer came over and met with me, and he told me that he can't change management, but he'll do everything possible to let me wait another week before payment.
Anderson power poles were designed and made for some other industry. Where were I've never seen them before you started using them. Okay.
Well, here's where I've seen them. I've seen them used with electric trucks that are used to electric forklift trucks. They're also used as great big ones to connect between trains. So if you see a train, I'm going to say a freight train, but I don't know if it's a freight train. But if you see a train, you'll see that they have these coupling. They're coupling the 600-volt lines between the subway train cars through these power poles.
I see. So Anderson's been in the business for years and years making these kinds of couplings.
And they're very big ones. They have about 10 different very big models, and big ones that are, 6 or 8 inches in diameter. I mean, in one of the dimensions of the power poles. Great big things, and they handle, high amperage and high voltage.
Now, do you think that Anderson power poles, should they be exercised every once in a while? Do they? I don't think that they oxidize, but do the connections become unreliable if you don't exercise? Unplug them and plug them back in every once in a while.
I bet that they would. I don't know that they do, but here's what I do know. I know that they are silver plated, okay, and the silver tarnishes, so that eventually something might happen. But don't. If you remember how they connect together, they're 2 flat plates that slam together with a little, angle on one side. So basically, they probably don't tarnish while they're connected.
And I've also heard that potentially that when used in automobile installations, that they could become flaky. Is that myth or fact?
I think it's myth. The only thing really wrong with power poles is the fact that they don't require a lot of force to connect them or unplug them. So that's the first problem. So that in a car, people will put a rig runner on the firewall, and then they run wires to their various radios that sort of hang down from that. And then a guy will put his foot up against the firewall and unplug his stuff by mistake because the wires are hanging down, okay, because they're not very, very solid. So that's the first problem. The second problem with power poles is that people, when they put them together, they don't shove the little pin in enough to make it click on the spring.
Right.
So that what happens is that they think they're together, and then they plug things in, and they realize that they have an intermittent connection. And I have received telephone calls that mine are intermittent. And you say, did you push them in so they clicked? They said, oh, I didn't know I had to. So that's the second problem. The third problem is that the tongue and groove, you slide them together, to make them hold. Sometimes that's a little bit feeble, and they don't, when you go to push them in, they slide apart. So they sell them with a little pin that you can put in.
Right.
To stick them together. But unfortunately, if you plug them together sometimes and they wiggle, the pin falls out. And don't do that over your transceiver that has holes in the top cover. So these are all the problems that we've had with them, but otherwise they are pretty good.
Is there a standard in terms of what side the red and the black go together?
Yes. Well, there's no standard, but there's a convention, okay? And the convention is that if you're looking at the power pole from the top, and the larger part is sticking out, and the smaller part is on the bottom. The red is on the right, and the black is on the left.
I try to make sure that all of my radios have the same convention.
Right. Well, you have to.
Yeah, if somebody comes, if you go to a field day and somebody plugs in, you want to make sure that they're plugging in right.
Right.
Oh, interesting. One of the things I've discovered, and I'm happy to share with the audience, is that I purchased some of the the red-black pair that you use with the Anderson power poles, and I bought some from China. And while it advertised that it was 12-gauge wire, what I had was very thick plastic with what looked like a number 18 wire in it.
They do this all the time. And when we used to purchase red and black wire, we went to China because we saw this good advertisement, and we ordered number 12 wire. And when it came in, we measured it was number 14 and a half, maybe 15 inside of it. We learned a lesson.
Right.
Be careful.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Where do you get the right wire?
Well, right now I don't buy it anymore from a major supplier. A major wire company. I buy my wire from PowerWorks here because he's a good friend of mine, and he's found that he can get overseas wire that's the correct dimensions.
Especially if you're using it not only around the shack, but for example in a automobile installation where you've got maybe you got the transceiver in the trunk, and you're running about 12 feet of wire.
Right. Well, there, if you can possibly use 10 when you're running a 100-watt transmitter, it'll be a lot better, because 12 feet of wire at number 12 gauge, you're going to have a little bit of voltage drop at 20 amps.
What about tying all of your rigs to a common ground bus? Is that important?
I think it's very important. Okay, especially if all the rigs are close together. Tie them to that ground, a big solid ground, and then run that ground directly to Earth. Okay, one of the biggest problems we have is that computers are grounded themselves, and when we hook them to your radio station, now you're connected also to the green wire of the house wiring. So it's very interesting. You have another ground that you don't expect sometimes there, and you can't do much about it.
Well, I've discovered with my computer, for example, in this whole recording setup that I have, I've got transformer isolators on every line in order to keep the hum out of it. How would you keep the hum off of out of your, if you've got a computer that's part of your ham station and it has that greenhouse ground, but you're also connecting to the station equipment, how do you isolate, or do you isolate, or you just you also bond the computer chassis to the station ground? Well, that's what I've always done. Okay, and the idea is that if the hum is insufficient enough to work, you have it made. But you'll always have a little bit of a ground loop. When we worked with our Rigblasters, of course, we isolated everything with transformers that way. And so basically the computer's ground didn't make it to the radio. But otherwise, these days, a lot of radios now have the ability to hook directly to the computer. And sometimes you're sort of stuck. So you actually have to bond the computer chassis to your station ground. What if you're on a second story where potentially the ground wire that's running out of your ham shack is long enough that now it becomes kind of a radiating element or part of the antenna system? That's a problem, and it always has been. I don't have much of an answer for it. What I say is that running with our antenna disconnect, I say, make sure that you ground your antenna properly, but you're sort of in trouble. Most everybody I know just eventually runs a ground outside their window on the second story and runs it directly to a ground. You're better off. There are many cases now that houses have good grounding, and they also have out here in Florida, they sell you some ground protection and isolation at your house. I don't know how that affects things. I really don't know. Although in Florida, I bet you have it's not very difficult to put a ground rod into the ground there. It's extremely easy. I bought a 10-foot piece of copper, and I drove it all the way down. It was the easiest thing going. I couldn't believe it. Just kept going and going. Well, that's amazing. Well, I had to hire a guy to actually dig a ditch here using a jackhammer because I'm sitting on limestone. And I put my ground rods in the ground sideways with can't remember I think it was I poured a bag of cement inside in the hole in order to create some good ground, but I don't know how good the ground is actually. You can ground and keep grounding and keep grounding. The idea is that you're trying to fool a lightning surge between the wet clouds, your antenna that's sticking up in the air, and the wet ground that might be of a different potential. So all you can do is do the best grounding you can. And the more grounding you do, probably the better off. But a single point ground for your radio is good. One thing that comes down, and a single point ground for your antennas is good. And then lightning will break down the ions, it will ionize air and go when it wants to. But lightning surge is the bad stuff, because a direct lightning strike is terrible, and it can do terrible damage. But lightning surge is the stuff that's always wrecking your radios and stuff. And good grounding is really necessary. I discovered that you're a member, and you mentioned it just a few minutes ago, of PCARS, the Platinum Coast Amateur Radio Society in Melbourne, Florida. And you mentioned to me before we started that you will be the new president. Do you think that local and live ham clubs are still important to our hobby?
I think they're extremely important, okay? I know that a lot of people, they don't go to their meetings and stuff, but first of all, socially, it's tremendous. It's just a lot of fun because all of the ham radio operators, including the ones that aren't very active, get together and meet their friends. And that's lovely. And they're very nice folks. Most hams are very conscientious and very nice. So that's wonderful. The second thing is that we use this to introduce new things, like PSK 31 was one of the meetings, and I've given lots of talks at ham stations too, and so people come for that. And thirdly, and the most important thing is that new members get to meet others, and we get to meet them, and we get to be Elmers for these new folks. And if you have a good club with the Elmers, and by the way, if people don't know what Elmers are, we're just the helpers that help new members that aren't familiar with ham radio. We help them with
mentors,
and it's such fun. And that's what it's all about. We have a lot of members that come here, and the meetings are really filled up here. So it's working, at least here, very well.
How does PCARS reach out to younger people, like kids or teenagers or people who were like you when you started?
Oh, my gosh. It's really sort of difficult, okay? I really don't know all the answers to that. I know that we reach out to a lot of people via our Boy Scouts. We meet with the Boy Scouts, and we bring ham radio apparatuses and little transmitters and 2-meter equipment to Boy Scout jamborees here, and that's very popular, and we get a lot of people to pay attention. We also have our field day, and we invite our friends and neighbors and their children to come over and operate what we call the GOTA station, the Get on the Air station, where we allow the folks to witness and have fun with ham radio. But other than that, it's very difficult. We do have ham radio clubs in the area that meet at some of the colleges, and we hope that what's on their college bulletin boards will entice some of the young college students to walk in and join in. But it's very hard. That question is very difficult because we really don't do a very good job of bringing new members in that are young.
You're a member of the Curacao Contesting Club Association. I interviewed Jeff Howard, W0CG, in episode 183 of the QSO Today podcast about it. How did you get involved, and what is your involvement now?
Okay, well, first of all, I got involved because a good friend of mine, W0NB, who was an audio engineer that knew my products from CBS Laboratories, one day gave me a call. And he also told me that he was buying land on the island of St. John next to the land that I own down on the island of St. John. So we became very friendly. But he said, "Dan, we have a contest club just starting down on Curacao, and would you like to come down for a contest?" And I said, "Oh, sure, why not?" And he invited me down, and I went down, and what an eye-opener. What an eye-opener that club was. So can I fill you in a little bit of stuff?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, first of all, I had been lazy on CW back then. It was about the year 2000. I was sort of lazy on CW, and I was doing a lot of SSB. And he invited me down for a contest. And about a month beforehand, I realized that I had agreed to go to the contest that was CW. I said, "My gosh, there's a big contest station, CW. Can I handle it?" Well, they put me on 10 meters and said it won't be very busy. But let me tell you, when I called CQ in the contest, it was open to Japan, and we must have had 5,000 Japanese stations calling within 10 minutes. And I learned to become a contester in that grueling hour and a half when the band was open. It was a lot of fun to peel off CW at high speed when they're all calling at the same time. And it was just a lot of fun.
Now, it's my understanding that Curacao, and I think I heard this from Jeff, is that it doesn't get, it's out of like the path of hurricanes normally, and it's in an unusual spot for multiplier points for many of the contests.
Yes. First of all, they've never had a major hurricane hit, although they've had a lot of high winds from close encounters, but they never had a hurricane hit. And why we sort of like Curacao is perhaps a little bit of it isn't cheating because it's all legal, but all of the Caribbean islands in the Caribbean are North America, except the islands directly off Venezuela that are in South America. So we have a multiplier of 3 instead of 2. So we get to kick butt a little bit because we multiply our scores by 3 instead of 2 because we're in another continent.
And how often do you go now?
I usually go down once a year. I'm going down at the end of March for the for the ARRL SSB, and I've invited 6 other members from the PCARS Club to go down as a group.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Oh, it's been fun. It hasn't had too much of on my family life, except when we go on vacation in various countries. My wife, of course, comes with me, and we get invited to hams' houses, and we get invited to ham clubs that we wouldn't get to see if I wasn't a ham. So she's had a lot of fun going with me to these places. When I was in Europe, I was invited to the ham radio club in Switzerland, and we had a wonderful time. The same in France, and a lot of my friends are her friends, or my friends are the hams, and their wives are my friends. So it's been very good. I wish my children had become hams, but they didn't. But it hasn't done anything except improve our lives, I think, and give us a lot more fun.
Does she go with you to Curacao when you go?
She has, but she's not going this time. She says that she's already seen all the museums and going snorkeling, and my involvement with ham radio is too time consuming, and I leave her alone.
What do you think the greatest challenge is to amateur radio now?
The greatest challenge to ham radio is basically that radio and is not well known by the general public, okay, including the young folks. They know about the internet. They know that satellite exists in their car. They can pick up satellite radio, etc. And they don't understand that this wonderful propagation that exists with shortwave, etc. So they're not excited about it. And they're not excited about talking to foreign countries like I was. And they don't know much about building equipment, because equipment now is microcircuits that are too difficult for them to dive into easily. Okay, and they don't have fun changing tubes, if you want to say that. Or they don't have fun soldering in big resistors because everything is done by a machine. So they sort of miss this, and it's very hard to get people into it. Some people get into this a little bit through what we call the Makers Guild. Ham radio doesn't have that excitement. One of the good challenges is that ham radio and 2 meters and repeaters has brought people into the emergency world, and people like to be part of helping in emergencies. But ham radio is missing the hobby of building amplifiers and building stuff that people like to buy.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, that's a tough question. I think what excites me the most is the fact that there's been a few new digital modes like FT8, and that excites me the most, although I'm not heavily involved with it. I've done a little bit in our club. But I think that the tie-in of the computer to the radio is the most exciting thing, except I fall back on my old hobby of CW, so I don't do as much as I used to on that. But that excites me the most, and I think that a lot of young people are thrilled that they can sit down and basically type and get a QSO, and then the new modes of FT8 and also JT88s and things like that, they're able to do moon bounce using those modes, which is, I think, pretty exciting. That excites me.
Right, with 100 watts and an antenna, it doesn't even need to actually be pointed. I guess it'd be pointed at the horizon. It's my understanding a lot of Europeans do moon bounce without huge arrays.
That's right.
Because of the digital modes, yeah.
That's right. And it's because of the incredible skill of guys like Joe Taylor that's written these incredible algorithms to allow you to hear below the noise line, the noise signal, and pull it out. It's amazing.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
Well, new hams, I like to advise. I'd like to look at the hobby and choose what you seem to like. Go and meet people, you meet other hams and see what they're doing, okay? That's the advice, because the hobby's got so many different things. I mean, we even have people here that are just thrilled to go on fox hunts. They love that. And now that's sort of silly, but heck, everyone has a good time. So my advice is to seek all the different sides of the hobby and just have fun and find one that and stick with one that you like.
Well, that sounds like great advice. Dan, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I've learned a lot about your story and about West Mountain Radio that I didn't know about before, and I appreciate the advice that you give on working on your ham station and making sure that it's grounded. With that, I want to wish you 73 and thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and 73 to all you listeners too.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dan. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an N1ZZ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.